Hello curious people, today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable now. I stepped into the stories. As the sun sets in the distance, dark clouds hang in the sky above, absorbing the last glimmer of daylight. Ben, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a thin beard, stares through the windscreen of his small, worn-down car while he waits at the traffic lights. He thinks about something his dad used to say. Red light, green light, sun. Gambling's all about instincts. You train yourself to recognize the signs until your brain tells you one of two things: red light or green light. The truth is that his dad lost a lot more than he ever won, and then one day he was just gone. No warning, no farewell. Ben swore he'd never do that to his family. But now, here he is, transporting something for a loan shark he owes £5,000. All he has to do is get it past airport customs and into the right person's hands, and that debt disappears. If he doesn't, it'll be him that vanishes. Betting on that horse seemed like a risk worth taking. He'd done the research. The odds weren't even that long. 5-1. A modest gamble on a horse with a great track record. He would have made £20,000 for his family after giving back the £5,000 loan. But things don't always work out the way they should. It was only a few hours ago, and the pain of it was still fresh. His mind couldn't help but replay the end of the race over and over again. His sure-thing horse had slipped back into second place on the last corner. One part of him accepted the loss, but the other was still in denial, still trying to spend those imagined winnings on a holiday for his family and paying off a mountain of bills. The race had barely finished before a message from the loan shark appeared on his phone. Unlucky, but don't worry. I've got a job just for you if you want to clear that debt. Unless you have £5,000 to pay me back in 7 days. They both knew he didn't. The only thing that Ben had of value to this loan shark was his job as a maintenance worker at Glasgow Airport. He had access to the building's employee-only areas, making him the kind of man who could sneak a small package past security and into the departure lounge. In the car, Ben reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a palm-sized box, etched with intricate gold patterns. Don't lose the box, the loan shark had told him at their meeting, or your family loses you. Understand? Of course Ben understood. He knew exactly what it was like to have your father disappear. He inhales and exhales slowly, trying to calm himself. But as the loan shark's threats leave his mind, it only brings into focus a feeling in the pit of his stomach, telling him that there's something wrong with this box. What's inside it? He holds it closer to his face, examining the unusual gold patterns which covers its surface. They look strange, almost otherworldly. As his fingers move around the box, a deep dread grows inside of him. The last time he felt this way, he was 11 years old, standing over the open casket at his grandmother's funeral. The fear he felt that day wasn't because he missed her. She had always treated his mother terribly, and for that he had never forgiven the old coot. No, it was something else. A horrible feeling he had that the haunting specter of that old witch was standing right behind him, lurking over his shoulder, watching him with a wicked grin as he looked at her corpse. That horrible feeling stayed with him for months after. Each night he would stare out from his bed, certain he could see his grandmother's menacing eyes gazing at him from the corner of the room. Back in the car, he hears a horn beep loudly behind him. Ben looks up and sees the traffic light has long since turned green. Shaking his head, he quickly drops the box into the seat beside him and presses his foot down on the accelerator. For another 10 minutes he follows the road ahead, before a car in his rearview mirror begins to distract him. He narrows his eyes, a frown on his brow, puts the phone in his lap, and peers up at the rearview mirror again. Half a minute later, his phone vibrates. Ben grabs it and reads the incoming message. Could be. That box is very valuable. You've been there for a while, he says aloud. He sees an exit up ahead and turns left, leaving the road. The car behind does the same. Ben grimaces. After a moment of deliberation, he reaches for his phone and begins texting. "I think I'm being followed. Big car. Red Toyota." He types in, sending it to the loan shark. Sighing, he adds a few buyers asking for it. "Don't lose it, or your family loses you." Ben drops his phone in his lap, then smacks his hand on the steering wheel. "Fuck," he says aloud. Seeing a turn up ahead, he signals left and exits the highway. Behind him, the trailing car makes the same turn. Ben quickly surveys his new surroundings, seeing rows of closed warehouses on either side of the road and little else. Sighing, he curses his luck. Couldn't have picked a worse fucking place to be right now. The car behind him starts revving its engine, speeding up as it overtakes him, before swerving suddenly and stopping in front of his car. Ben slams on his brakes, bringing his car to a halt in the middle of the road. Two thuggish men get out of the car in front, one slim with a hammer in his hand, the other broad-chested and carrying a crowbar. Ben looks around his car for something to use as a weapon but sees nothing. As the men close in, Ben locks his doors. "Open up," shouts the bigger of the two thugs as he pounds his fist on the driver's side window. Ben looks up at him through the glass, shaking his head. The other thug grins as he spots the gold box sitting in the front passenger seat. Ben turns quickly, reaching over to it, but just as he wraps his fingers around the box, he feels shards of glass spraying one side of his face. Wincing, Ben turns to see the driver's side window smashed and the larger thug reaching through it to open the door. He unclips Ben's seatbelt and pulls him out of the car, onto the road. Soon a flurry of blows rains down on Ben as blood begins trickling into his eyes, blurring his vision. He feels another pair of hands pulling back the fingers he has wrapped around the gold box, prying it from his grasp. The punches slow to a stop. Ben's attacker breathes heavily, waiting to see if his bleeding victim has any fight left in him. On the ground, bruised and dazed, Ben barely moves. "Let's go," says the scrawny thug. Images begin flashing through Ben's mind. He sees his wife and daughter at home, oblivious to his current situation, with a pile of unpaid bills on the living room table. He imagines his wife working day and night to support their daughter alone. Suddenly, his eyes open. He sees the thugs walking away from him toward their car. A surge of energy pours through his body. Ben pushes himself up off the ground and rushes forward, before lifting up his leg and stamping his foot down on the side of the large thug's knee. With a crunch and a snap, the man's leg breaks beneath Ben's foot. The thug roars in pain as he collapses to the ground. Startled, his skinny partner runs towards his car and jumps into the driver's seat, revving the engine and taking off. Turning quickly, Ben leaps into his own car and races off after him. As he follows the man along the winding road, Ben grips the steering wheel tightly, his mouth snarled in anger. He knows what will happen if he doesn't get that box back. His family will think he's abandoned them, while his body rots in a hidden grave. Ben presses his foot down on the accelerator, racing as quickly as he can down the road towards his target. Suddenly, up ahead, the thug's car lights disappear from view as it veers to the left, obscured by a derelict building. "You won't get rid of me that easily," Ben says aloud as his car flies down the road. He sees the sharp turn and swings the steering wheel to the left, his tires screeching. Barreling down the road at speed, he spots the thug's car lights up ahead. Stationary, confused, Ben slows his car and pulls up beside it. Smoke billows from the car's bonnet, its left side embedded in a wall. Ben quickly gets out and approaches the crashed car. Leaning over, he peers through the window but can't see anyone inside. He looks around for signs of the thug fleeing on foot. Nothing. Ben grabs the door handle and opens the passenger door, gazing inside. In the footwell, lying by the accelerator pedal, he spots the glistening edges of the golden box. Wasting no time, Ben scrambles over the seat and grabs it, then gets out of the car and looks around again. Where the hell did he go? He asks aloud. Shrugging, he turns around and gets into his car. Sat back in his seat, he stares at the box in his hand. He can't help but wonder what's inside it. The loan shark never told him. And Ben got the feeling the guy didn't even know himself. He just said he had a foreign buyer willing to pay silly money for it. Must be something small and very valuable. Probably diamonds. Rare ones. Enough to change someone's life for good. He finds himself imagining a fresh start for his family. A new life somewhere better. Somewhere far from trouble. He could give his daughter the opportunities he never had. He could make it up to his wife for a decade of broken promises. Then he remembers the loan shark and shakes his head. It's just another gamble. Not worth the risk. Grabbing his phone, he checks the distance to the airport. Not far, he says, before putting the golden box into his jacket pocket and restarting his car. Ben inhales, then exhales, collecting himself as he drives the car down the quiet road lined with derelict warehouses and sparse foliage. A mile up ahead, he sees an exit which leads back to the motorway. He feels a trickle of relief setting in. Then suddenly, he spots something on the side of the road. Ben narrows his eyes, peering at it as the car moves closer. It's a long, thin figure. A person. Oh, what now? He says aloud, slowing the car slightly in case it's someone in need of help. But as he approaches the figure, a horrible feeling begins stirring in the pit of his stomach. An old, familiar sense of dread. From neck to toe, the figure is dressed in a long, blue funeral gown. Their head turns towards Ben's car, staring directly at him. His mouth falls open, his eyes wide as he gazes at his long-dead grandmother. Without hesitation, he slams his foot on the accelerator and turns his attention back to the road. Stress, he says to himself. It's just stress. But as he drives away, he can feel her gaze burning into the back of his head. A flood of memories washes over him, each tinged with pain. He remembers being 9 years old, stood in his mother's kitchen when his grandmother turned to him with a sour expression. "You remind of your father," she told him coldly, before adding, "What a pity." But she was wrong. He wouldn't make his father's mistakes. He would stand by his family. He would provide for them. Up ahead, he sees the turn onto the motorway and takes it. 15 minutes later, Glasgow Airport finally comes into view, its lights illuminating the sparse countryside which surrounds it on all sides. Excited holidaymakers move through the parking lot dragging suitcases behind them, while Ben grows ever more anxious with each passing minute. He parks the car, then reaches into the back seat, grabbing a bag filled with his work clothes before pulling on his high-vis overcoat and affixing his employee badge to the card holster on his chest. Ben looks at himself in the rearview mirror, seeing streaks of dried blood on his face. He grabs a small cloth and wipes them off, then gets out of the car. A minute later, he's in the building, approaching a door marked "Employee Access Only" and swiping his card on a panel, stepping through onto the concrete walkway on the other side. Ben's heart is racing, but he knows he has to act calmly. Pretend it's just another day at work, he tells himself. He inhales, then exhales, then tries to look as bored as possible. His footsteps echo against the bland, stone walls as he makes his way deeper into the basement, through hallways dotted with security cameras. Suddenly, he spots another worker headed in his direction, an older woman with a tired expression on her face. Ben's heart beats faster, sweat tingling his forehead. He unconsciously taps the box in his pocket, checking it's secure, before swiftly moving his hand away. "All right," he says to her. She gazes at the employee badge displayed on his jacket before nodding solemnly. He soon reaches another secure doorway, scanning his employee card again, and walks through into a labyrinth of hallways until eventually he reaches a door labeled "Waste Disposal." Entering the room, Ben looks up at the ceiling, relieved to see no security cameras. He approaches one of the large bins, unlocking its wheels, then pulling it out of the room and down a wide corridor until he reaches a large set of doors. He stops and looks through a small, square window. On the other side, he can see two waste collection workers are stood, relaxed, cigarettes in hand as they chat to each other. Nervously, he watches the two men. 1 long minute later, the pair of them toss their cigarettes onto the ground and stamp them out. Go the other way, go the other way, Ben whispers aloud in prayer as he stares at the workers through the door window. Suddenly, they turn, walking over to a different exit, leaving the area without seeing Ben or the bin he's dragging behind him. He sighs in relief, wiping sweat from his brow. Composing himself, he opens the doors and drags the bin along another corridor before pushing it up against a wall, right beneath his target, a large ventilation duct. Ben climbs on top of the bin and reaches up to the metal grate covering the vent. Grabbing a screwdriver from his pocket, he carefully removes the screws from each corner, occasionally stopping to listen out for footsteps, before returning to his task. Breathing heavily, he removes the last screw and slips it into his pocket, then lifts off the metal grate and places it on top of the bin. Taking a deep breath, Ben pulls himself up into the vent and moves forward a few meters until the vent is wide enough for him to turn around and wriggle back over to the entrance. Leaning out of the vent, he grabs the grate from on top of the bin and carefully puts it back in place, before turning around once more and dragging himself forward, deeper into the ventilation system. Ben moves onward determinedly, keeping track of his location by peering at the rooms below through gaps in the vent. As he slides through it, his waist moving from side to side, the box in his pocket begins knocking against the metallic surface. Hearing this, Ben slows his movements, worried he'll draw someone's attention. But as he does so, another sound filters through to his ears, something scratching the vent somewhere behind him, like a pair of talons digging into the metal. He stops, turning his head, peering over his shoulder. Anxiously, he stays still and listens. "Ben, my boy," says a slow, croaking voice. The rasping sound echoes through the vents. A shudder runs down Ben's spine, chilling him to his core. The image of his grandmother's corpse dragging itself through the vent burns into his mind. He shakes his head, trying to will the idea out of his brain. But the scratching sound only gets louder. Whatever it is, it's getting closer. Hurriedly, he starts moving again, picking up his speed with each passing second. The box begins tapping against the side of the vent as he crawls forward, but Ben doesn't care. He has to get out of there. Half a minute later, he sees the men's toilets below and presses his head against a grate, quickly scanning the stale, brightly lit room. He can't see anyone below. In the vent, Ben begins quickly unscrewing the grate as the scratching sound gets closer and closer behind him. With the last screw undone, Ben hurriedly pulls off the grate and lowers himself down into the cubicle. He shuts the cubicle door, then stands on top of the toilet, pulling the grate back over with the tips of his fingers. He stops, listening carefully. Nothing. It's just stress, he whispers to himself, before stepping back down onto the floor. Ben pats his jacket pocket, feeling for the small golden box with his right hand, while his left reaches into his trouser pocket and grabs his phone. He lifts the phone closer to his face, scrolling through his contacts list before pressing on one titled Drop Off, Delete After, and selecting the Send Message option. He quickly enters a short message. "I'm here now. Men's toilets. Middle cubicle." Ben's finger moves toward the send button below the message, but he pauses. He looks down at the box, moving it around with his fingers, looking over every corner. A dark line where the box would open runs around 3 of the 4 edges. A vision of the box's contents drifts through his mind. A small pile of diamonds, enough to start a new life with his family if he sold them for himself. He'd disappear, yes, but he'd take his wife and daughter with him. A surprise holiday, maybe. He could tell them he'd won the lottery. Pack the bags and don't look back. He shakes his head. It's not worth the gamble, he assures himself. But then he looks at the box again, its golden edges reflecting the bright, halogen lights above. He feels the edges of it in his hand. On one side, its golden pattern points upward towards the dark line running around the middle. Ben gently runs his thumb over it, imagining the diamonds inside. Too many to count. Too many to notice if one or two went missing. Not right away. Not if he and his family were on flights the next morning. Pack the bags and don't look back. His eyes begin to glaze over as his thumb runs across the edge of the box. Just a peek, he tells himself, as he pushes against the top half of the box, lifting open its glistening lid. Ben furrows his brow, his lips pinched. He stares at the open box, confused. Inside, there's nothing. Every edge of the interior is as dark as a black hole. He turns the box in his hand, looking over each side of it. Suddenly, tiny spores begin to float out from the box, drifting like a dark mist towards the nearest surface, the cubicle wall. As they make contact, small sparks appear and disappear, the surface bubbling as the spores burn into it, transforming it into something else. Mere seconds pass as the spores quickly spread and consume the surface, creating a dark window into nothingness. Ben stumbles backwards, his back pressed against the other side of the cubicle as he drops the box to the floor. He turns his head towards the door lock, quickly placing his fingers on the latch and sliding it back. Suddenly, two crimson, ragged arms reach out of the black hole towards him. Barely a second later, their jagged fingers slice into his body, gripping him like a cooked chicken thigh. Ben's left thumb tenses in pain, unintentionally pressing the send message button on his phone before it falls out of his hand. A second later, his body is pulled violently toward the dark void. He tries to grip the cubicle wall, but he's completely overpowered, disappearing in an instant before the void vanishes along with him. On the floor, the box's lid slams shut. Outside the cubicle, a set of footsteps can be heard entering the toilets and approaching the door. "I'm here," says a gruff voice. Slowly, the door swings open. A rough-looking man peers through the doorway tentatively, expecting to see Ben. He scans the banal-looking cubicle with his eyes, then spots the golden box on the ground and grins to himself. Leaning forward, he grabs it off the ground, giving it a quick look over before sliding it into his jacket pocket. He grabs his phone and types in a message. "Got the delivery. Guy's not here. Probably left already." Satisfied, he quickly turns towards the exit and re-enters the departure lounge. Horror games are probably one of the most popular types of games in the gaming world. That's because of the combination of suspense, fear, and excitement they offer in a way that no other genre can match. Every horror enthusiast wants to feel their heart racing out of the excitement and adrenaline when they're solving different quests in the game. It's hard to resist the storylines, surroundings, mysterious characters, and unexpected quests that attract players deeper into the games. In this article, we're going to list 5 such PC games that tend to be especially popular among horror lovers these days. 1. CS::GO 2. Every gamer has tried CS::GO at least once in their lives. Counter-Strike 2 is a game for multiple players where two teams, counter-terrorists and terrorists, shoot against each other using different kinds of weapons, including pistols and grenades. All of the battles are graphically drawn very clearly, and the thing that draws people towards this game is the intense action that keeps you on the edge of your seat. However, it's not only about the gameplay. The reason why players still adore CS::GO after all this time is that graphics and weapons are updated all the time. Thanks to the option of customizing the game, you can get the best AK-47 skins and personalize the weapons to your taste. Considering all of this, if you enjoy horror games, this one will definitely remain one of the best choices for players of all ages. 2. Visage. Visage is a game by Sad Square Studios, which is actually the first game from this studio. It's a psychological horror game that is set in the 1980s. The character who you played is Dwayne Anderson, who's experiencing torment by paranormal activities happening in his home and is trying to find out what or who is the supernatural causing all this. During the game, you can see the lights turning on and off, the doors slamming, and how the light bulbs breaking out of nowhere. All of this can happen very unexpectedly, which makes the game very horrific and mysterious and requires a lot of patience while playing. For anyone who's not afraid to test themselves, this game is a must-try. 3. Pathologic. This game was released in 2006, and with the game's structure, you could say that it was way ahead of its time. Pathologic is a mysterious horror game that is set in a town where a sand plague is spreading. The player can choose one out of the 3 characters and has 12 days to survive and find out where this mysterious plague is coming from. One exciting thing about this game is that while you play, you have different quests every day. And if you miss a day, the quest for that specific day will be gone. This makes the game even more intriguing. And expect to be highly tensed during the game because the constant pressure to make the right decisions in time is what makes every moment unsettling. 4. World of Horror. World of Horror absolutely deserves to be on your horror games list. The game takes place in Shiokawa, Japan, and the players have to stop an apocalypse while facing various scary monsters and exploring the territory inside the game. Not surprisingly, the game is inspired by Japanese horror manga, but not only. It also has some elements of urban legends. The graphics of the game are very different from the rest of the games we mentioned above, so it's styled as a 1-bit pixel game. Thus, it's almost like very detailed drawings, which help you get into character easily and catch the mood of the game. Even though World of Horror can be a scary game, if you enjoy the horror genre, it will certainly become one of your addictions once you try it. 5. The Cat Lady. For people who are searching for a game that has a very deeply touching, interesting story, believe us, The Cat Lady won't disappoint you. The Cat Lady portrays a lonely woman named Susan Ashworth, who's 40 years old and has just committed suicide. After her death, she wakes up in a strange limbo, where she meets the eerie Queen of Maggots, who gives her tasks to remove 5 parasites. This is the only way she will find peace. In the game, you have to collect different items and solve puzzles while exploring the horrific environment around you. You can also dictate Susan's choices by controlling the dialogue, from which you can see the character's terrible mental health and suffering. Thus, if you enjoy psychological horror and are looking for something that's easy to play, you should add the Cat Lady to your gaming list. Final thoughts. Obviously, these 5 horror PC games are not for everyone. But if you are a fan of spine-chilling experiences, intense storylines, and eerie tales, these games will likely offer you exactly what you're looking for. Yes, it's true that some of the games count decades on their shelves. But trust us, just give them a try, and you'll quickly notice their ability to deliver fear and excitement even today. I proceeded to the rendezvous on foot, having asked my taxi driver to drop me off a couple of blocks away. This was not the wisest decision in retrospect, but I wanted to keep a low profile and avoid the attentions of both the cops and the gangs who lurked the streets. I carried a taser and pepper spray in my jacket pockets, but doubted these defensive weapons would provide much protection if it came to the worst. A cold and constant rain fell on my head as I proceeded down the dark and seemingly abandoned road. Many of the streetlights had been vandalized, and the city authorities were understandably reluctant to conduct repairs in this part of town. Therefore, the street I walked was largely shrouded in darkness, but this suited me fine, as I wanted to remain hidden in the shadows. Nevertheless, I surveyed my surroundings carefully as I proceeded slowly towards my destination. The road was quiet. I didn't see any other pedestrians on the sidewalk or cars on the street, but this didn't mean I was alone out here. I listened out intently, only to hear the heavy patter of rain hitting asphalt and the distant barking of dogs echoing off concrete buildings. There were little in the way of commercial premises in this neighborhood. The few businesses that had once operated were mostly burnt out during the riots, their charred husks still standing as a lasting monument to anarchy and violence, which had engulfed this sprawling metropolis only weeks before. I shook my head in disgust, looking up into the dark, starless sky as the raindrops fell on my face. It wasn't meant to end up like this. Sure, this once great city had long been plagued by violent crime. But there was still hope, not so long ago. Many believed the tide was turning, that the unlikely coalition of vigilantes could deliver an ultimate justice upon the human monsters who stalked the streets. But their mission had backfired badly, and now the crime fighters were wanted criminals themselves, fugitives from the law and on the run from the cops. But what had gone wrong? This was the question which interested me. There was a story to be told, and I wanted this scoop more than anything. This was why I was willing to take a considerable personal risk to attend tonight's meeting. I had a long history with the so-called Supernatural Vigilant Association, having been the first journalist to reveal their existence all those years ago. So when I received the phone call from my source, I couldn't resist the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I continued to ponder these matters as I proceeded along the empty sidewalk. But I shouldn't have let my thoughts wander, because I didn't notice the approaching vehicle until it was too late. The squad car rounded the corner and glided slowly down the street towards me. Its siren wasn't blaring, and the blue lights were off, so I guessed this was just a routine patrol. Nevertheless, I was concerned as the police car crept alongside me until the vehicle was directly adjacent to the pavement. I slowly and nervously turned my head in time to see the single uniformed officer in the driver's seat, a gray-haired veteran with hard eyes which glared towards me suspiciously. I was frozen on the pavement, not knowing what I should do next. I did briefly consider running, but this would only make me look guilty and surely prompt a pursuit. Technically speaking, I wasn't breaking any laws, but I also didn't have any good reason for being in this part of the city so late at night. The cop might use his powers to stop, search, and question me. I could even be detained. The charges wouldn't stick, but I would miss my meeting, and surely my source wouldn't give me a second chance, and so I was understandably nervous in that moment, as everything would depend upon the police officer's next actions. I stood still as he brought his squad car to a halt and shined a torch in my face. I squinted as the light hit my eyes, temporarily blinding me. "What are you doing out here, kid?" asked the cop, his voice gruff and unfriendly. I thought for a moment before stuttering my response. "Good evening, officer. It's a hell of a night, isn't it?" I shouted, struggling to be heard over the constant rainfall. I think I got turned around somewhere. "Can you tell me where the nearest subway station is?" The cop lowered his torch but continued to glare at me with suspicion. I felt certain he didn't buy my weak cover story. The question was whether he cared enough to intervene. A lengthy pause ensued before the cop's radio burst to life, and he received a call from dispatch. I didn't catch the details through the static and rain, but the policeman's expression suddenly changed as his attention was drawn away from me. He offered me quick-fire advice before departing, saying, "The subway's 5 blocks in that direction. I'd get there quickly if I were you. This is not a safe neighborhood after dark." With that, he put his foot down on the accelerator and sped off into the night, the squad car's sirens blaring as he rushed to respond to the call. I breathed a deep sigh of relief as I watched him go. I was soaked through to the skin, but nothing could dampen my spirits as I took my final strides towards the meeting place. The rendezvous was a seedy hotel located on a back street and away from prying eyes. The establishment's name was the Sanctuary Inn, and it was one of the few remaining businesses in this neighborhood, although the small and run-down hotel was anything but legitimate. I felt a twinge of doubt when I looked upon the glaring neon sign hanging above the reinforced steel door. I had a pretty good idea what happened inside this joint. To the best of my knowledge, its main customers were junkies shooting up and prostitutes entertaining their johns. It seemed ironic that former crime fighters would end up taking refuge in a den of sin such as this, but desperate times made for strange bedfellows. Under normal circumstances, I would never enter such an establishment, but this was where the story had brought me, and I had to follow the lead. I swallowed my fear as I approached the fortified and uninviting front entrance, pressing the intercom button with a shaking finger as I nervously looked up at the security camera. There was a short pause followed by a burst of static and a deep voice which called out from the other side. "Who the fuck are you?" he swore. I was somewhat taken aback, but answered nonetheless, lowering my head so I could speak directly into the intercom. "My name's Carter. I'm here to see Mandrake. He's expecting me." Another pause followed, and for a moment I feared I'd made a mistake, but after a few seconds I heard a satisfying buzzing sound as the door's lock was opened. Pushing through, I shook off the rain as well as I could before entering the dimly lit and grimy hotel lobby. My nostrils were soon hit by the stench of mold, damp and bodily odors which I didn't want to think about. I proceeded across the suspiciously sticky floor towards the front desk, which I noted was surrounded by a security cage. I ignored the sign on the far wall listing the hourly rate for rooms and prices for miscellaneous services, instead looking to the unpleasant man who sat behind the desk, his long hair greasy and his eyes filled with malice and lust. His crusty lips curled into a crude smile as he looked me up and down with contempt. I noted how his right hand was under the desk and reckoned he was probably reaching for a gun. A television was blaring in the background, but the weasel-faced man was focused upon me, for the time being at least. "So, you're the journo?" he asked dismissively. "You don't look like much to me. Not built for this world, are you, kid? Sure you don't want to run home to your mama?" He laughed cruelly, in open mockery. I was pissed off but kept my cool, not rising to the bait as I replied through clenched teeth. "I'm here to see Mandrake. Can you take me to him?" The foul receptionist scoffed as he looked away from me and back at the TV set. "Mandrake's in room 13 on the second floor. The elevator's bust, so you'll have to take the stairs." With that said, he was done with me. I elected not to thank the man as I proceeded to the staircase under the dim lights. Walking up the stairs and along the narrow corridor on the second floor, I ignored the shouts and moans coming from the other rooms as I reached No. 13 and knocked firmly on the door. "Come in. It's open," was the reply. I froze for a second since I recognized the voice all too well, even though I'd never met the man face to face. I experienced a cold chill in the second before I grasped hold of the door handle, twisting it, and proceeding inside of the small and squalid hotel room. The man inside looked totally out of place in this vile establishment, and yet here he was. Mandrake sat up from the mattress, shooting me a charming smile as he offered his hand in friendship. I noted the immaculate three-piece suit he wore and the wide grin on his lips which showed off his pearly white teeth. Mandrake exerted the same charisma and confidence in real life as he had done in the many online videos he'd recorded and uploaded over the years, as he performed his role as the public face of the SVA. I took his hand and shook it, noting his tight grip as he pulled me in closer. In another life, Mandrake might have been a businessman or media personality, but there was another side to him which I knew all too well, as I'd spent years studying the man and reporting upon the many killings he'd ordered and coordinated. But even if I hadn't known Mandrake's history, there was something in his eyes which would have given him away. There was a darkness in those eyes, the killer's look which he couldn't fully hide, even beneath all his charm and smiles. I tried to stop myself from trembling as I reluctantly met Mandrake's gaze, but I wasn't fooling anybody, least of all my host. He knew I was afraid of him, and yet I'd come to meet this man in a place of his choosing. I experienced a sickness in the pit of my stomach upon realizing a simple fact, that Mandrake could kill me right here in this seedy hotel room, perhaps to take revenge for all the negative articles I'd published over the years, which had damaged the SVA's reputation. I had to trust that he was genuine about wanting to tell his story, and I was his means of doing so. "Mr. Carter," he said amicably whilst maintaining a tight hold of my hand, "what a pleasure to meet you at long last. Please, grab a seat and take off your wet coat. May I offer you a drink?" "No, thank you. I answered nervously before taking the chair closest to the bedroom door. Mandrake nodded knowingly as he sat back down upon the mattress facing me. I apologize about the venue. Regrettably, this is what we've been reduced to as we try to keep one step ahead of the authorities. I'm sure you met Eddie on the front desk. Yes, I replied hesitantly. He is certainly a colorful character. He's scum, Mandrake answered through clenched teeth. Vermin, the pimp and a dealer, the type of which we would have gladly dispatched in years past. But Eddie knows which side his bread is buttered, and we can count on his cooperation and discretion during our brief stay. I looked him in the eye uncertainly before replying. That's good. Now, Mr. Mandrake, as you know, I've taken a considerable risk in coming here today, but I'm eager to hear your side of the story. I'd practiced those words repeatedly in preparation for this meeting, and I tried to exert confidence in my voice, even though I was frightened by the perilous situation. You told me over the phone that you've got someone for me to meet. I continued, a former SVA member who wants to give their side of events. Mandrake nodded his head and smiled faintly before replying. You are indeed eager, Mr. Carter, always keen to pursue the story. I admire this about you, even though your reporting has often damaged our organization's standing. He cast me a hard glare, which made my blood turn to ice. But don't worry, my friend. Mandrake continued, this is all water under the bridge. I do indeed have someone important for you to meet tonight. In fact, she's waiting in the next room. He nodded towards the inner doorway which connected rooms 13 and 14. But first, I want to speak with you one-to-one, Mr. Carter, to provide you with a brief history of our organization so you can better understand where we came from and how we got here. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. I knew what was coming, a propaganda speech from the representative of a designated terrorist group. I'd heard this many times before, but felt like I needed to humor Mandrake to keep his good faith. We have all witnessed the failure of our justice system, he began. We know the endless victims who have been let down, while perpetrators walk free or are handed out pathetic sentences. I and a few others decided enough was enough. We identified a number of special individuals with powers beyond conventional understanding. Many of these candidates had been victims themselves, but they lacked the capability and resources to retaliate against those who'd wronged them. That's where the plan for the Supernatural Vigilante Association came in. Our plan was to utilize the powers of these extraordinary individuals to target the right people, the truly evil motherfuckers who deserve to be put down. But you need to understand, Mr. Carter, we didn't go into this blind. We knew the risks of taking the law into our own hands. Who polices the police, right? Our intention was. I interjected at this point. It wasn't wise to interrupt Mandrake in mid-flow, but I lost my temper upon hearing this all too familiar justification. With respect, Mr. Mandrake, none of this is new information. I have reported extensively on the origins and formation of the SVA. The public know all too well how this started and how it ended. What they want to know is what went wrong and how you arrived at this dark place. I regretted the words as soon as I'd spoken them. I saw the anger in Mandrake's eyes, the resentment and rage which boiled just below the surface. He glared at me with murder in his eyes, and I felt my body stiffen. I started to reach for the taser in my inside pocket, but didn't think it would do me much good. I felt certain that violence would ensue, but thankfully Mandrake pulled himself back from the brink, exhaling deeply before the smile returned to his lips, and he answered calmly, "Of course. You are quite correct, Mr. Carter. Our time is limited and we must press on. If today's interview goes well, I hope to arrange further meetings so you can speak with more of my comrades. These brave men and women have stories that need to be heard. Now let me introduce you to the Voodoo Priestess, one of our very first SVA activists. Spooky narrative audiobooks." Mandrake raised his volume as he shouted through the connecting door. "Tabitha, can you please come in here?" A tense pause ensued before the door swung open, and an astonishing woman entered. I sat forward in dismay as I watched the beautiful, dark-skinned woman, dressed in a traditional and colorful dashiki, walk into the room. Her brown eyes glistened as she looked down upon me, her powerful gaze drawing me in. But my instincts told me not to stare into those eyes for too long, lest I get sucked in by her dark power. I noted the Ankara bag she carried over her shoulder and dreaded to think what was contained within. And I felt a strange mixture of fear and frustration in that moment, struggling to stand as I took Tabitha's hand, experiencing a surge of energy as our palms touched. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Carter. I have read all of your articles. Your work is illuminating, if not always accurate." I stared into her deep brown eyes, and my knees felt weak, like I was a nervous teenager talking to a pretty girl for the first time. "Well," I muttered nervously, "that's why I'm here. To get your perspective." Tabitha smiled sweetly, although I noticed a menacing glint in her eye, which made me feel uncomfortable. Nevertheless, I took my seat whilst Tabitha sat on the hard mattress opposite me. "I'll leave you both to it," said Mandrake, as he made for the door. He turned his head briefly before exiting, looking to his female comrade before saying, "Shout if you need me, Tabitha." His comment struck me as odd. I was certainly no threat to Tabitha, quite the opposite in fact. But a moment later he left the room and shut the door behind him, leaving the two of us to speak in private. Once Mandrake was gone, Tabitha looked me straight in the eye, and once again I felt myself slipping into a dark abyss. That was until I forced myself to look away. "I want you to know something," she said firmly. "I'm not just another freak of nature who inherited a supernatural power beyond their understanding. My power was taught, passed down through multiple generations through the female line. Ours is an ancient tradition, a religion charting its origins back to Africa, through Haiti, and finally here, to the city shrouded in darkness." She sighed deeply and lowered her head before continuing in a softer tone. "But I'm not here to provide a history of my people or of voodooism. We did not start as vigilantes, although the priestesses who joined the SVA had their reasons. They call us witches. They think we're devil worshippers. Everyone knows what happened, about what we've done. But I need you to understand why. That's what I want to know," I answered nervously, still not daring to look the woman in the eye. She exhaled deeply before speaking again. "For me, it began with my parents. My mother was a powerful priestess, capable of great things. But she had a fatal weakness, her husband, my father. He was a brute who beat her constantly. Father was a large man, and he could hit hard, but Mother had the power to bring him to heel. She could have ended him with a mere click of her fingers, but she wouldn't. She loved him, you see. Mother kept telling herself that he'd change, that the latest beating would be the last. She kept believing that lie until he put her in the grave." Tabitha looked up, a fiery defiance entering her voice as she delivered her next line. "I could do nothing as a child. But as my powers grew, I vowed I would never let this happen again." "So, that's how it started for you?" I asked curiously. "To seek justice for your mother?" "In a sense," she confirmed. "I wanted to stop abusers from getting away with their hideous crimes, to make them feel the pain and suffering they inflicted upon others. But before I unleashed justice upon the unrighteous, I needed a test run. As it happened, there was a suitable candidate in my own apartment building, not even half a mile from where we now sit." I raised an eyebrow, chilled by where this account was going but also intrigued. I thought back on all the SVA-related murders I'd reported on, but couldn't recall one linked to Tabitha. I sat back in silence whilst patiently waiting for her to continue. "They were my neighbors who lived on the same floor. The woman was called Tracy and the man was Kyle. They kept themselves to themselves at first and seemed like a nice and happy couple to the untrained eye. But I'd grown up in an abusive household and knew the signs to look for. I noticed how Tracy wore extra clothes to cover up her bruises, how she always seemed nervous when I saw them together in the elevator. And I recognized the look in his eyes, the unjustified hatred and barely concealed rage. I knew a killer when I saw one and realized it would only be a matter of time before he ended his girlfriend's life. She paused, swallowing deeply in an attempt to control her emotions. The police would do nothing. There were no witnesses and no real evidence. I knew I'd need to take it into my own hands. Now you've seen all the depictions of voodoo in the movies, pricking pins into dolls and all that bullshit. We don't do that, but there are methods, dark magic we can use to punish our enemies. It took me a while to make the necessary preparations and to gather the material I needed for the ritual. I won't betray the secrets of my craft. You understand that I still owe loyalty to the spiritual movement which trained me. Suffice to say, I obtained personal items relating to my target. A strand of hair, a treasured heirloom. I have my means, and I'm patient. When all was in place, I conducted the ritual and evoked a dark spirit to set upon my target. Now, I didn't set out to kill Kyle. I wasn't ready to use such extreme measures at that time. Perhaps I was weak, I don't know. She hesitated again as a sadness became evident in her dark brown eyes. I felt obligated to reach forward and touch her hand, shooting Tabitha a sympathetic smile as I prompted her to go on. "What happened?" I asked. "I thought I could weaken him," she said softly. "My plan was to break his spirit, to make him sick and weak so he couldn't hurt her anymore. But it didn't work." I asked, whilst withdrawing my hand and looking her straight in the eye. "Oh, the spell worked fine," Tabitha replied defensively. "I know for a fact that he was bedridden and in agony. Tracy told me as much when I saw her." She sighed aloud. "I guess I should have seen it coming. It's the same pattern playing over again. With my mother, with Tracy. Kyle getting sick didn't set her free. It bound her to him. I thought she'd use the opportunity to escape from the abusive relationship, but I guess Kyle had her firmly under his control because Tracy stayed by his side and wanted to nurse her abuser through his illness." "Jesus," I swore in shock. "Yeah, tell me about it," she replied. "What did you do then?" I pressed. Tabitha shook her head, and I could tell she was trying to hold back the tears. "The sickness spell wore off, and of course he started hurting her again. I knew there was only one way to end the cycle," she explained emotionally. "I realized that I had to kill him. It was within my power to do so, but I hesitated. Perhaps murder comes naturally to some, but not to me. All was ready on that night, and I truly believe I would have gone through with it. I was prepared to speak the words and summon the darkest of spirits from the underworld, but I waited too long. We were briefly distracted by a noise from the next room. I swore I heard Mandrake's voice, and he sounded agitated. This was worrying, but I chose to ignore the potential danger because I needed to hear the conclusion of Tabitha's story. Just before midnight, I heard raised voices and crashing sounds coming from Tracy's apartment. Tabitha explained. I knew what this meant, and so I leaped up onto my feet, running out into the corridor and banging on their front door. I heard Tracy's screams from inside the apartment and knew there was no time. So I used my bag of tricks to force open the door before I burst inside. But it was already too late. Tracy was on the floor in a pool of her own blood, a dozen stab wounds punctuating her torso as she slowly choked to death, and the life force drained from her frightened and pained eyes. And Kyle stood over her, a manic look in his eyes and the bloody knife in his hand. He glared at me with a murderous glint and snarled through curled lips. He called me a bitch and claimed I'd turned his girlfriend against him. Kyle was going to make me pay. With that, he charged towards me with the knife in hand. I cried out and tried to flee, but Kyle was on me in a second, knocking me to the ground and pinning me down. The monster was on top of me, his eyes bulging and spittle flying from his mouth as he tried to bring the blade down and plunge it into my chest. I expended all of my physical strength to prevent him from doing so, but my mind was in another place. I spoke the words and used my true power, evoking the darkest of spirits from the other side to claim his wicked soul. Kyle suddenly stopped his attack, dropping the knife and climbing off me. his eyes now filled with unadulterated fear as his face turned a ghostly pale. I spotted it before he did, the dark shadow which appeared as if from nowhere, taking the shape of a man as it glided across the apartment floor. Kyle turned around slowly, screaming in sheer terror as he saw the demon approach. I'd never seen one of these dark spirits in action before, and I must admit it was horrifying. What monster had I brought into this world? I wondered in that moment. But there was nothing I could do to stop it. I remained frozen on the floor, watching on in terrified awe, as the demon consumed the screaming Kyle in its dark form, crushing him and sucking his soul from his physical body. The deal was done, and Kyle was dragged to hell, leaving his lifeless corpse to collapse to the ground. My God! I exclaimed upon hearing the end of Tabitha's tragic tale. I heard nothing about this killing. It wasn't claimed as a SVA operation, was it? No, Tabitha said with a faint smile. She looked towards the connecting door, and I noticed how Mandrake's voice had increased in volume, as it seemed he was shouting down the phone in the next room. Back then, Mandrake had connections with the local police, Tabitha explained. They covered up the crime, writing it off as a murder-suicide. No one ever knew the truth of Kyle's death, until now. Mr. Mandrake said I did the right thing. He told me I was a special talent, and they needed me as a full-time SVA operative. But I couldn't. I'm not a killer, and I can't live with the guilt, so I've decided to come clean, no matter what the consequences. She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, perhaps hoping for empathy or absolution. My jaw dropped, and I found myself speechless. I hadn't expected this. I'd always considered the SVA as ruthless killers who eliminated their targets without remorse or afterthought. But Tabitha didn't fit the bill. She genuinely regretted her actions. But why had Mandrake introduced me to her on this night? Was he deliberately trying to show a more sympathetic side of his violent, vigilant organization? I wanted to ask these questions and many more, but there was no time. As a moment later, Mandrake burst through the connecting door and shouted a frantic warning. "We need to leave right fucking now," Mandrake exclaimed, his eyes full of intensity and his face red. "What the hell, Mandrake?" Tabitha replied. "They found us," Mandrake confirmed. Tabitha's eyes widened in shock as she struggled to reply. "Who has?" "The cops. Advertisements." "No," Mandrake answered firmly. "It's that son of a bitch Hennessy. The PI. He wants the bounty on my head all for himself. That rat bastard Eddie sold us out." We heard the heavy thumping of boots in the corridor outside, and I knew the threat was real. "You can deal with this," Mandrake said while speaking directly to Tabitha. I noted how he pointed to her Ankara bag whilst doing so. "You can summon the dark spirit and send Hennessy straight to hell," the vigilant exclaimed. "No," Tabitha replied firmly and without hesitation. "I won't do it. Not again." Mandrake appeared angry for a moment, glaring at Tabitha as if to challenge her defiance. But the voodoo priestess was not backing down. "Oh well," Mandrake said in a more conciliatory tone. "I guess it's time for less subtle methods." Next, he got down on his knees and retrieved a weapon previously hidden under the bed, which I instantly recognized as a pump-action shotgun. He worked the gun and loaded a shell into the chamber before turning to us both and giving a firm order. "We're going out. Stay behind me." We both obeyed as Mandrake opened the bedroom door, and the three of us tumbled out into the corridor. I glanced into the darkness and saw two men charging towards us, their faces illuminated by the dim strip lights. The first man I recognized as Eddie, the greasy hotel receptionist turned traitor. Eddie's eyes widened in shock as he realized his betrayal had been discovered, and he scampered backwards to take shelter. Meanwhile, the second man dropped down to one knee and aimed a pistol in our direction. I saw he was dressed in a dark trench coat and had a deep scar across his cheek, but I could see little else in the dark, other than the gun. I assumed this newcomer was Hennessy, a bounty hunter in pursuit of Mandrake and his people. "Give it up, Mandrake," Hennessy shouted in a gruff voice. "It's all over for you." "The hell it is," Mandrake replied defiantly. And then he opened fire with his shotgun. The buckshot tore down the corridor, winging Hennessy, but failing to take him down. A moment later, the bounty hunter returned fire with his pistol, his bullets missing us by mere inches and slamming into the wall behind us. "Go," Mandrake screamed over his shoulder. "Get to the fire escape. I'll meet you on the street." His frantic orders were directed towards Tabitha and me, and we didn't hesitate, dashing down the corridor side by side whilst more bullets whizzed over our heads. I can barely remember our escape down the back staircase, as I remained in a state of acute panic throughout the mad dash. I don't know how we made it out, but miraculously Tabitha and I reached the relative safety of the rubbish-strewn alley behind the hotel. I noted how the rain had now stopped and thanked God for small mercies, but we weren't out of the woods yet. I could still hear gunshots and frantic shouting from inside of the building, and also the sound of distant sirens on the city streets, as surely the cops had been alerted by the gunfire. I looked to Tabitha in a blind panic, only to find her surprisingly calm. "We need to go," I shouted frantically. "Just wait." Tabitha responded whilst looking back towards the fire escape. "Mandrake will make it out. He always does." I shook my head in disbelief and prepared to flee as the police sirens grew louder. But Tabitha was right, as a moment later Mandrake sprinted down the staircase. He appeared frazzled, and the still smoking shotgun remained in his hands, but the vigilant leader was still very much alive. "The Fockers will get me one day, but not today," he proclaimed defiantly with a smile on his lips. "My story does not end here." No doubt he wanted the valiant quote to appear in my article, and I must admit that he struck an impressive pose in that back alley, an anti-hero fighting back against the odds. But Mandrake wasn't stupid, and he wouldn't wait around for the cops to arrest him. He promptly grabbed a hold of Tabitha's hand before shouting in her ear, "Come on, priestess. Our carriage awaits." The unlikely couple made to flee. But before he ran, Mandrake cried over his shoulder towards me, saying, "Mr. Carter, I trust you can make your own way home. Keep your phone on, please. I'll be in touch." I watched the pair flee down the darkened alleyway, noting how Tabitha shot a look of sadness and regret before she was led into the shadows. I was frozen in disbelief for a brief moment, but the ever-increasing din of sirens brought me back to life, and so I took off in the opposite direction and disappeared into the night. My editor was very happy with the story I delivered, but less so with the risks I'd taken to land it. Nevertheless, my exclusive hit the front page and promised to be the biggest scoop of my career. But the story didn't end there. A week later, I got word that Tabitha had walked into a police station to hand herself in, making a full confession for her part in Kyle's violent death. I guess she couldn't live with the guilt any longer. There is a lot of interest in the case and some debate over whether the voodoo priestess will ever stand trial. To the best of my knowledge, there are no laws against summoning a dark spirit as a means of self-defense. In another development, the body of Eddie, the Hotel Sanctuary's sleazy proprietor, was found abandoned in an alleyway, his flesh being gnawed by rats and other vermin. Eddie's hands were tightly bound behind him, and he'd been shot twice in the back of his head, execution style. There were no witnesses and no forensic evidence, but it was obvious to me who was responsible. Surely Mandrake had taken revenge on Eddie, punishing the hotelier for his betrayal. This murder would send a powerful message to anyone who was tempted to sell him out. And now Mandrake is the most wanted man in the city. The entire municipal police force is on his tail, not to mention Hennessy and a dozen other heavily armed bounty hunters. The price on the vigilant's head has now doubled, rising to a cool $2 million. But at the time of writing, my most prized source is still at large, and he's not done with me yet. Just yesterday, I received a call from an unknown number, and I instantly recognized the charismatic voice on the other end. "Mr. Carter," Mandrake said enthusiastically, "I did enjoy reading your latest article. I think perhaps you're beginning to see things from our perspective. It's a shame about Tabitha." The woman had so much potential, but she lacked the stomach for our line of work. Still, like I told you that night in the alleyway, my story isn't over. And neither is yours. What do you mean? I said, feeling apprehensive but also intrigued. I have more special people for you to meet. Mandrake said coyly, more extraordinary stories for you to hear. I'll be in contact when I can arrange a secure place to meet. I know the risks involved. I almost died the last time around. And I've no doubt that Mandrake is dangerous and highly manipulative. And yet, I can't walk away from this story. The Vigilant has me on the hook. And he knows it. But Mandrake's narrative isn't necessarily the reality, and I must do my due diligence as a professional. I shall uncover the dark truth of the SVA, no matter what the cost. I was jealous, extremely jealous, and to make this dirty, rotten feeling even more vile, the person whom I was jealous of was my very own little brother. More specifically, I was jealous of his relationship, his life. He was going to be a husband, and not just any normal, typical husband. He was going to be the husband to the most beautiful women I had ever seen. My own little Bible thumper brother finally one-upping me. I turned bitter. I hated it. Me and him shared only half-blood, and even though we were raised in separate households, we remained close. We kept our brotherly connection. I remember as kids we would sneak out late at night, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. We'd meet at the park and play until sunrise. I missed those times. I missed how he used to be. But most of all, I missed how I used to be. But as people do, they change, and we could not have turned out any more opposite. He grew up with our dad, with Christian beliefs, going to church every Sunday, praying before every meal. He was a real believer, some would say. For me, I became a disappointment, 37 years old with no wife, a crappy job, and a bit of an alcohol problem. My life had turned out different. No religion, no discipline. I was at a very low point, and my little brother was the shining star of the family. Even though he didn't mean it, he was constantly rubbing it in my face with his fancy car and house. Not to mention his happy, smiling wife standing by his side. And now Mandrake is the most wanted man in the city. The entire municipal police force is on his tail, not to mention Hennessy and a dozen other heavily armed bounty hunters. The price on the Vigilant's head has now doubled, rising to a cool $2 million. But at the time of writing, my most prized source is still at large, and he's not done with me yet. Just yesterday, I received a call from an unknown number, and I instantly recognized the charismatic voice on the other end. "Mr. Carter," Mandrake said enthusiastically, "I did enjoy reading your latest article. I think perhaps you're beginning to see things from our perspective. It's a shame about Tabitha. The woman had so much potential, but she lacked the stomach for our line of work. Still, like I told you that night in the alleyway, my story isn't over. And neither is yours." "What do you mean?" I said, feeling apprehensive but also intrigued. "I have more special people for you to meet." Mandrake said coyly, "More extraordinary stories for you to hear. I'll be in contact when I can arrange a secure place to meet. I know the risks involved. I almost died the last time around. And I've no doubt that Mandrake is dangerous and highly manipulative. And yet, I can't walk away from this story. The Vigilant has me on the hook. And he knows it. But Mandrake's narrative isn't necessarily the reality, and I must do my due diligence as a professional. I shall uncover the dark truth of the SVA, no matter what the cost." I was jealous, extremely jealous, and to make this dirty, rotten feeling even more vile, the person whom I was jealous of was my very own little brother. More specifically, I was jealous of his relationship, his life. He was going to be a husband, and not just any normal, typical husband. He was going to be the husband to the most beautiful women I had ever seen. My own little Bible thumper brother finally one-upping me. I turned bitter. I hated it. Me and him shared only half-blood, and even though we were raised in separate households, we remained close. We kept our brotherly connection. I remember as kids we would sneak out late at night, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. We'd meet at the park and play until sunrise. I missed those times. I missed how he used to be. But most of all, I missed how I used to be. But as people do, they change, and we could not have turned out any more opposite. He grew up with our dad, with Christian beliefs, going to church every Sunday, praying before every meal. He was a real believer, some would say. For me, I became a disappointment. 37 years old with no wife, a crappy job, and a bit of an alcohol problem. My life had turned out different. No religion, no discipline. I was at a very low point, and my little brother was the shining star of the family. Even though he didn't mean it, he was constantly rubbing it in my face with his fancy car and house. Not to mention his happy, smiling wife standing by his side. Happy fucking birthday to Mr. Perfect over here. You little four-eyed fuck. Why don't you go and finally lose your virginity, you little nerdy-looking piece of... Someone came from behind me and escorted me away from the table. For a moment time stood still, but I soon realized it was just the deafening silence surrounding me. I begrudgingly stumbled my way to the exit. Even in my drunken stupidity, I felt more than a little embarrassed. I must have got a taxi home and crashed out on my couch. When I woke up with a pounding head, it was only 10 p.m. Jesus, I must have left early. I had a funny thought after this. If my brother lived in my head, he'd be telling me to stop using the Lord's name in vain. Thankfully, he doesn't. Checking the time on my phone, a random number suddenly appeared. Through habit, and not paying much attention, I accidentally answered it. It was my dad, the dad that wasn't there for me, the dad that probably called just to scold me and tell me how much of a screw-up I was. He said in his scratchy tone, "Look, what you did was real shitty, son. You know Mason really looks up to you. I have no idea why, but he does. And you go out there today of all days and do that to him." I had no answer. "All I'm asking you to do is apologize to him." And Lily. "Fine," I replied and hung up. I tried calling him to somewhat apologize, but there was no answer. So with all my wisdom, and still slightly tipsy from the free beer, I decided to head to his house, chap the door, and if he didn't answer or was not in, I already knew where he kept his spare key, under the front door mat. I expected him to be home. He never was the type to stay out late, and I didn't think even his own wedding would stop him from his strictly followed 11 p.m. bedtime. I called the cab and arrived at the front door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, this time harder. No answer. Then I began rattling the door with my fist. No answer. Must not be in, or in a deep, deep sleep, I thought. Lifting up the mat and retrieving the key, I let myself in. Entering inside, my first thought was, why were all the lights off? I called out Mason to no reply. He always kept at least the bathroom light on. "Mason," I called out, more louder this time. Still no answer. He was always afraid of the dark. From infancy all the way to the age of 35, my brother feared darkness. One time he told me, when we were a lot younger at a sleepover, that he felt if he stayed in the dark for too long, the blackness would swallow him. I don't know why, but that always stuck with me, even now. Proceeding forward, blindly looking for a light switch, feeling the walls with my hands, swaying in all sorts of different directions, I finally switched on the light. "Mason," I called out, this time in a voice of panic. He must still be out. I'll wait on him. I sat in the brightened kitchen, with my head leaning on my fist. I'll tell him I got too drunk and made a mistake, and that I didn't mean it, but the word sorry didn't need to leave my mouth. It didn't take me long to realize something was wrong. Getting back up on my feet, a smell, an unusual smell of silver, flooded my nostrils. It was strong, and it was coming from inside. The closer I followed this progressively more disturbing smell, the closer I came to his bedroom. I opened the bedroom door and the smell hit me harder. I could taste it on the tip of my tongue. It tasted like sucking on a coin or licking steel. It reeked of potent metal. When I entered, there was nothing but darkness. I switched the light on. The bed was painted red with roses in the shape of a love heart. A scented candle unlit sat beside the bed. But this is not what I first noticed. A body lay straight and naked on the floor, its legs and arms spread open. There was no face to this person, only a bloody hole. It looked as if someone had chewed and crunched on the eyes, nose, and mouth, leaving only a blank canvas of thick flesh and stringy, twisted, meaty lines of gore that were only visible through the stained bone of the face. I shot back in horror, resisting the urge to vomit. The smell made itself clear to me. This was my brother, mutilated and dead on the ground. Here's a revised version of the paragraph that removes any content violations while keeping the suspense and emotional intensity intact. I froze, staring at the body of the only person who ever truly cared for me. His face wasn't the only part of his body that had suffered. His chest was torn open, a deep wound that left a chilling emptiness where his heartbeat once was. The sight of it made my stomach churn. I couldn't help but look closer, and it became clear he had been violently attacked. I felt a wave of nausea rise within me. The only words I could manage to whisper were, "I'm sorry." I kept hoping that somehow this was all a nightmare, that I would wake up, that none of this had actually happened. I was about to leave the house, to call the police, to wait for them, and explain everything. But then I heard something coming from under the bed. It was the sound of slow, labored breathing. It was deep, like something large, something struggling to breathe, almost as if it wanted to be heard. My heart pounded. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just the wind, or something else? The thought of what it might be terrified me. I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. I called the police, but didn't wait for them to arrive. As I walked out, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Where was Lily? My brother's wife. Where was she? The funeral. I sat alone in the back of the church, my face buried in my hands as I silently cried. "I'm so sorry," I prayed, hoping somehow, she could hear me. For a week after the tragedy, I could barely get out of bed. I ate little and spoke to no one except the police. They made me repeat my story over and over. But each time, when I mentioned hearing something under the bed, they looked at me like I was losing my mind. They told me they were investigating, but I never heard back. At the funeral, Lily stood there in a black dress, her eyes hidden beneath a veil. Even through her tears, she didn't say a word. It was as though the weight of her grief had taken her voice. I watched her for a long time, feeling the unbearable sadness and frustration that came with the silence. No one acknowledged Mason. No one spoke of his life. It was all about the ceremony, about rituals that felt meaningless in the face of the loss we were all experiencing. I felt anger rise within me, but I didn't act on it. I had no energy left to fight. After the service, Lily was surrounded by mourners, but I couldn't bring myself to stay any longer. I turned away without a word, still haunted by the questions I couldn't answer. The following days were harder. This is only the second person close to me to have died. My mother being the first. She died of a heart attack when she was only 67. Still, this did not compare to the horror I had witnessed only a week ago. The image stuck in my mind, along with the smell and the breathing noise. Where the hell was Lily? I had asked the officers while being questioned, and they told me they didn't know yet. I emailed, messaged, phoned, even went to the goddamn police station, and each time I got the same answer. We cannot share other witnesses' statements while the case is ongoing, and that Lily is not considered a suspect. Well, where the hell was she? Just tell me, please. This soon took over my life. Any answer would satisfy me. I just needed to know that she wasn't involved, and that it was just some sick nutcase that broke in. It's strange how that would have put my mind at ease. About a week after the funeral, I called her. She never answered. That was until about 9 p.m. when she called me back. It was a quick call. She told me she'd come over, and we talked. She told me she was sorry for my loss, and that Mason always talked about me. He looked up to you, she said, and we arranged to meet that very night. Not long after the call, I heard the knock at my door. I opened it to find her. She wore a long coat that made it look like she wore nothing underneath. I let her in, and she gave me a sad smile. We sat down on the couch, and she removed her jacket to reveal a skin-tight red dress. She always looked stunning, but in that dress, any man would say she was irresistible. I began the conversation. "You okay, Lily?" "Better now," she replied. "Lily, I have to ask you because I have no clue what happened before I found him. Where were you?" She looked at me with pitiful eyes. "Logan, I know this is hard to hear, but I never went home with Mason. We had a bit of a falling out after what you did. We had a sort of fight," she said in her soft whisper. "We were arguing over you, and well, it escalated, so I went to my sister's house." "I never knew you had a sister," I said, wiping away at my eyes. "We aren't so close, but she was the only person I could go to." My heart sank and tears forced their way down my cheeks. I tried to spill out words, but all that came out was a yelp of pain, and I began to cry into my hands. She moved in closer to me, leaning over me and embracing me in a motherly hug. Time stood still, but unlike the wedding, it was real, except I felt sad, scared, and safe all at once. She was comforting me in a moment of vulnerability, and I continued to let it all out, snot flooding out my nose. I cried out in shame. Her face got closer to mine, and her comforting hug suddenly turned into a sexual grope. Her hands moved lower down, and her lips nibbled on my earlobe. She whispered softly, soothingly, an inch away from my ear, "Let your lust loose." I tried breaking away from her, but she gripped me in closer. She began licking my ear, licking the wet tears that were still trickling down my face. Her tongue felt thick. It felt slimy. It felt like a big dog was licking me. This made me rip away from her tight grip. Pushing back, I jumped away from her. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled in confusion. She smiled ever so seductively. "What?" she replied. "You know you want to. I've seen the way you look at me, Logan. Come on." She approached me slowly, stepping lower to the ground with each step. "Get the hell out," I commanded aggressively. She looked up at me, still grinning gleefully. "Fine. Have it your way." She walked over to the door and muttered something under her breath that made her giggle. She left, leaving the door hanging open. I closed the door and locked it. Staring up at the ceiling, I imagined my brother looking down on me. I began crying again, this time violently. The plan. A couple days had passed after I let her into my home. I had vivid but very strangely real dreams of me and Mason. It was more like memories, happy ones. I'd wake up from the good times and quickly realize my reality. I instantly sank back into my depression. What had happened to me with Lily had not felt too much different from these dreams, a bad, revolting, disgusting memory that plagued my head. Why did she do that? There's something more to this. I know somehow she was involved with my brother's murder. But why? He was wealthy, but it wasn't like he was anywhere near rich. He was a humble Christian that went to church every Sunday for God's sake. Why would she want him dead? Why did she start touching me, licking me? I had no clue that this would not stop me from finding out and exposing her for who she really is. Who even was she? The real Lily, I mean. I was not quite sure yet, but I did know one thing. She was not who she appeared to be. She was a freak. I couldn't tell anyone what she did. I knew for a fact people would not believe me, especially so soon after what had happened. People would have looked at me as a sad, pathetic little man trying to grab attention, ruining someone else's reputation, just as I did at the wedding. A man lying through his teeth to make himself feel better. I brainstormed ways in my head of how I could find the truth, and no light bulbs flickered. The police were a letdown. No one in my family would listen to me. How was I going to do this? A small faint burst of light unwillingly went to my mind. What if I asked my dad? Lie to him. Tell him I wanted to apologize to Lily and see how she was doing. Maybe he'd know where she lived. Maybe he knew more. As much as I wanted to stay far away from that man, particularly now more than ever since the only person holding us together had been brutally taken away. However, this was the only option clear to me. I got in my car and headed to meet my father. I arrived at his bungalow and banged the door hard. I heard him crankily yelling to himself from inside. He opened up the door to me, and at first he looked surprised, but this look quickly turned to a look of disapproval. He stared at me like a completely different man from the wedding and funeral. He appeared double his age. My brother's death must have taken a toll on him, not only emotionally. "What do you want? I ain't got no money." "Ain't here for money." "Then why are you here?" "To see how you are." He began chuckling to himself. "Cut the crap. Really, why are you here? Are you gonna let me in or make me stand out here like I'm some sort of Jehovah's Witness?" He replied under his breath. "I'd prefer it if you were a Jehovah's Witness." He walked back into his home, leaving the door open. I entered at the back of him, closing the door behind us. Walking through the hall, images of Christ and crucifixes were hung up in display all throughout the house. If my brother was a real believer, my dad was a step above that. A true believer, I'd imagine he'd title himself. We made our way to the living room, and we both sat down on the couch at the same time, mirroring one another. "Now what is it?" he said. "I was being serious about seeing how you are, but to be totally honest, I need to ask you something." His old hard face had softened slightly. "I need to know where I can find Lily. I never got that chance to apologize." "I see. That's actually quite mature of you, son," he said, his voice not as scratchy as it was usually. "So where can I find her?" "You can find her at her home." "Dad, I don't know where she lives. That's why I'm asked." He interrupted. "She lives in her house." "Mason's house." "What? I thought the house was written in your name." "I gave her it," the old man replied, looking off into the distance. I was going to start shouting at him, telling him how stupid he was, until I realized that wouldn't get me anywhere. It would blow my cover. All I could let out was a "oh." He switched the TV on, and we sat in an awkward silence for a while as Judge Judy blared in the living room. "I gotta go," I said, and his attention turned from the TV. "Be safe, son," he said, and went back to watching his game show. I stood at the door ready to leave, but before I did, I asked curiously, "Dad, did Lily go home with her sister that night at the wedding?" He looked at me like I was lost. "What are you talking about?" "She went home with Mason that night. I gave them both a ride home." My mind wrestled with possibilities. It fought with the lies and what I had witnessed with my own eyes. I would have told him everything I had seen. He was my dad, but Mason was his son, his real son. If he believed me, the truth would have hurt him, and that man had already been through enough. I left without answering or saying goodbye. It would have been boring sitting in my car all night, waiting, counting the clock. It really would have been, but I was focused, patient in my mission. It was around 9:30 before I noticed anything. I could see her shadow roaming the house, and soon after I could see she was getting ready to leave. A taxi pulled up to the home, and I watched as she left the house and entered the vehicle. Her beauty remained, and she wore a belly top and a skirt just long enough that you couldn't see everything down there. "What a bitch," I said to myself. "Not even a month after your husband of one day was murdered, and you're going for a night out." I tailed the cab, following slowly from a distance. The cab arrived at a local club, the Diamond, and she left, making her way into the line. I parked out the back of the club. Thinking to myself, I asked, what am I even going to do? Take a photo of her at a club? Oh yeah, great, that proves she's a monster. That proves she was involved with the death of my brother. No, all it proved is that she didn't really care for him, that it was all an act. Maybe that is all I needed, all I wanted to prove. So I waited all night long. By 11 p.m. my eyes began feeling heavy. I would slap myself in the face hard enough to leave a red mark each time they folded shut. I put the radio to max volume. I never touched my phone, as it only had 16% battery life left, and maybe a chance to photograph her would come. This went on until about 1 a.m., and I was really questioning if she had already gone home. But still I stayed, and soon my patience was granted a gift. She left out the back exit, and I sprang out of my seat, phone in hand. Somebody had left close behind her, a tall, muscular man, happy as can be. They were laughing, drunkenly staring into each other's eyes. My stomach turned, but still I watched as they began kissing, holding onto one another, pulling each other in tighter, making out with tongue and all. My phone whipped forward, and I pressed record, zooming in. I stared through my phone and noticed something wasn't right. The man was trying to push her off, get away from her. She held on to him, pulling him in closer, kissing him harder. What I saw next destroyed what I had believed possible in this world. What I saw was no pretty women. The man's face appeared petrified, and he was visibly aching in pain. He managed to break free of her lips for only a mere moment, and I saw blood pouring from his mouth. Then I saw it. Her tongue was huge and long, like a snake trying to escape her throat. The man leaned back in unearthly horror. Her lower face split. She tilted her head back, and her mouth widened so wide that her face began to change into something else. From below her nose, her face had burst into 4 separate entities. Her mouth had become a twisted, grotesque Venus flytrap. It turned inside out, showing hundreds of razor-sharp teeth attached to red-soaked, squishy tissue. Her head that was arched so far behind her it was almost hanging behind her back, smashed forward, latching onto the man's skull. The man cried out in agony until a spurting, splashing noise echoed in the dark. It bit down, gnawing, biting, eating. His eyes popped out their sockets, and eventually it consumed the man's face. His body thudded, dropping to the floor. The thing knelt down to continue her meal, but before it did, she looked. She looked over to me, in my direction. Though its face was mangled and disfigured, its eyes completely dead and lifeless, I could tell it was smiling at me. I had almost forgotten I was recording. It never ran over to me, or started to chase. It looked back to the body and began again, eating away at the corpse. I sped off into the night, questioning reality, wishing I had stayed away, wishing I had not gotten involved. God save us. I arrived at my home, throwing anything essential in a suitcase. I was prepared to leave, prepared to get as far away as possible. That thing knew where I lived, and I sure as hell was taking no chances after what I saw. I found out what I wanted. That thing killed Mason, his own wife. That is what was breathing under the bed, and if I had engaged in her seductive advances, I would have become another victim devoured. I was quicker than I probably needed to be, firing everything at random into the suitcase. I left my home without stopping to say goodbye. I was gone, and the only thing sane left in my head was drive. Drive fast and long, and don't you dare ever look back. It wasn't like I had anyone else, not like she could hurt anyone else in my life. Shit, my dad. No. I can't leave him, can I? Does she know where he lives? Am I willing to take that chance? In my car, speeding off into the night, I turned back. I have to make this quick. I shot back in my automobile, almost hoping to be stopped by the police. I drove furious and also terrified towards my father's home. The old fart better wake up. I charged at his front yard and punched the door so hard and fast, I wouldn't have been surprised if the old man had a heart attack. I yelled frantically, "Dad, it's me, Logan. Let me in now." After about 10 seconds of this repeated loud noise of panic, I heard him get out of his bed, yammering back at me. He unlocked the door, and I sprung on him. "Dad, we have to leave now." He attempted to talk back, but I couldn't let him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, ready to show him the proof, and the battery was dead. Shit. Of all times to die, it chose now. He looked at me confused, still half sleeping. I grabbed onto his shoulders, looking deep into his soul. I told him, "Dad, Lily is not what she seems. She murdered Mason, and we have to get out of here before something happens." He looked at me, his eyes waking up, widening. He replied, "Son, have you seriously been taking drugs again?" I pulled onto his dirty white vest as if to emphasize, "Dad, I'm being serious. We have to get out of here." I tried to drag him outside, but he wouldn't budge. He refused to move an inch. He refused to move, but I could tell he was alarmed. I could tell he was worried, scared that I could be telling the truth. He said, "Now slow down and tell me what in our dear Lord's name is going on." "You're going to die. You old dumbass, hurry the hell up." He looked at me distressingly, scratching the roof of his balding head. "If you're going to use that sinful word in this home, you're best to leave yourself." I dreaded wasting any more time explaining myself, so I told him I'd explain everything to him in the car, but we had to leave. I told him to grab what he needed, and that he had 1 minute or else I'd leave. He lazily walked around his apartment turning on lights, going into his wardrobe in his bedroom grabbing clothes, while I stood nervously in the hall outside. He left the bedroom giving me a look that said good to go. And as we just about reached the handle of the exit, my dad said, shoving his palm to his forehead, "My Bible, I forgot my Bible." He rushed back to get it, and I held out my arm stopping him. "I'll get it, Dad." He nodded his head, and I headed to the bedroom. I entered the bedroom, seeing the Bible on his bedside desk. I walked over, reaching out for the book. No, not again. That noise, that breathing was here, in the same room as me, under the bed. This time, I didn't need to check on it. This time, it showed itself to me. I saw small, fake, petite women's hands reach out from under. I gripped the Bible closer to my chest, backing myself away from the corner of the room. It teasingly rolled itself out from under the bed. Its neck twisted around, and its legs and arms were wrapped in a spiral as if it was unfolding itself. She stood straight up in one revolving motion and stared at me, smiling. It methodically advanced towards me, and I stumbled backwards, repeating, which was meant to be in my head, but was now spurting out aloud, "Oh God, please, oh God, no, please, God help." The woman stopped in its tracks, its grin growing larger. It said, still in its soft girl whisper, "God can't save you now." My dad called something over to me, as if to question if anyone was there. I backed up, hanging outside the hall, visible to my father, who was looking at me with utter confusion. The beautiful figure that stood in the doorway began to melt. Her soft hand reached for her face, and she peeled off the skin as if it was a mask, revealing a completely new inhuman skull underneath. Its long tongue showed itself, moving around as if it was a completely different being. It began ripping at its own body, arms and legs. Claw knives bulged out of the skin, fingers tearing it off completely. Piles of flesh dropped to the floor until its whole human appearance was gone. It changed. The only earthly comparison that I could make is that it looked like a giant rat. A giant rat straight out of Satan's cellar. My dad's confusion burbled over into panic as he witnessed my pale face taken over by terror. I fell into his hallway walls, holding the Bible up to my face, surrounded by crucifixes. He hurried his way over to me, and instantly came to a halt as he saw what had come crawling out the bedroom. It scurried over to me, hovering its hellish face over mine. Its breath reeked of the metal smell, and blood fell from its jaws, dripping over my face. Its tongue ran over me. It was tasting, savoring which was about to come next. Its claws cut into my arms, holding them in place. Its arched head sprang back, then forward, aiming for my face that I had moved in a split second. It bit down with force, missing my face, and instead ripping into my shoulder. I let out an agonizing squeal that echoed in the halls. It took its time tearing into me. It had a sick pleasure of hearing my pain, and continued to nibble on the puncture wound in my shoulder. It snatched the Bible away from me, throwing it behind itself. It was back to targeting my face as its slimy tongue started to dance, slithering all over me. I closed my eyes, not wanting this haunting, ungodly image to be my last. I thought of Mason. I thought of joining him in the afterlife, hopefully up in the clouds above. You may not believe me if I say this, and a part of me doesn't either, but I think I started smiling, laughing in this crisis of pain and certain death. The beast once again raised its head, letting its sharp teeth free. It stared down at me. It hurled itself back at pace then. Bang, 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 bang. Click click. My hearing faded, and I thought I was entering a different world. Opening my eyes, I saw only my father looking back at me. He was holding the biggest and nastiest shotgun I had ever seen. Then I realized what had happened. I was covered from head to toe in some sort of black substance that was leaking all sorts out from the monster that lay still beside me. Me and my dad stuck to our plan. We left, calling the ambulance and cops. We left home and never looked back. Now I am at a much, much happier place, as is my dad. We moved far, far away from our old lives, and now live in. Probably best to not reveal that information. Police searched the house and told us they found no signs of anything. No intruder, nothing. That part still keeps me up at night. The video on my phone for some reason did not save. It could have been anything, but I put it down to the fact that my phone must have run out while I was recording. I like to think that I somehow redeemed myself and in a way avenged my brother. But deep in my head and heart, I don't know if I have. I live every day a step at a time, and even occasionally tend to church with my father. I look back on this as another lifetime. This idea of demons roaming the world is not so far-fetched as it seems. Evil takes shape in many forms, and the devil is always tempting the weak and good-hearted. Always remember, you never know what darkness lurks deep inside someone, and you never know when they'll let that darkness out. The elderly man clutched the phone next to his ear, his face a mask of concern. "How long is he going to be there?" he asked, his voice low to avoid drawing attention from the patrons wandering into the nightclub. He listened, then said, "How's he holding up?" A pause. Then he nodded. "That's right, it's tomorrow, isn't it? I'll put together something for him. Something special." The man, his eyes weighed down by tired bags, closed the phone, then slipped it into the pocket of his worn sport jacket. He surveyed the nightclub he managed. The dim room held a sparse crowd, listening lazily to the half-hearted music produced by a second-rate guitarist on stage. The manager shook his head, as if that could shake away thoughts of the phone call he'd just finished. "The show must go on," he muttered. He went backstage and spotted the night's next performer. A tall, youthful figure in faded velvet and crimson gloves. The manager approached the magician. "All right, kid, you're up next," he said. "The crowd's thin. They're not expecting much. Do your best, okay?" The magician adjusted his top hat and grinned, the smile reaching his piercing blue eyes. "Don't worry. They're in for something special." The guitarist wound down his lackluster act and shuffled off the stage without a word. A bored MC appeared, barely glancing at the sparse crowd scattered across the dingy room. Under the weak, flickering spotlight, he droned into the mic, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the amazing Alex." His voice held the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. A few stray claps echoed weakly, drowned by the slurred laughter of a drunk perched at the bar. "Oh, great," the drunk jeered, swaying slightly. "Another rabbit out of the hat clown." The magician mounted the stage. He bowed deeply, holding his pose for a moment, before straightening. He held out his arms in a welcoming gesture. "Good evening, ladies and, well, mostly gentlemen." The heckler belched, waving his drink dismissively. Yeah. So what you gonna do?" The magician's jovial smile didn't falter. "Actually," he said, his voice dropping into something conspiratorial, "I'm not going to tell you what I'll do." The audience stirred, some leaning forward in their creaky chairs. "Instead, you," he swept a hand toward the crowd, "are going to tell me what I'll do." A ripple of murmurs waved through the room. The heckler snorted. "What a joke," he slurred. From the back row, an aggravated voice called out, clear and cutting, "Make that guy shut up." The magician's smile widened mischievously. "Granted," he said, and with a snap of his fingers, a puff of smoke erupted around the heckler. When it cleared, the drunk was clutching at his throat, eyes wide in surprise, his lips moving but no sound escaping. The crowd laughed and offered a smattering of claps. A bold voice from up front shouted, he's just a plant." Alex perked up and grinned. "A plant, you say?" He snapped his fingers again, and another puff of smoke surrounded the drunk. When it dissipated, only a potted plant sat on the bar stool. The crowd laughed and offered appreciative applause. "Who's next?" asked the magician. The bold guy leaned forward again. 25 grand. Right here." He slammed his hands on the table in front of him, the force of the gesture causing some of his beer to slosh over the rim of his glass. "Sorry," the magician replied with a playful smirk. "Only one trick to a customer." The bold guy grumbled a bit, but his protest soon petered out. Alex turned his gaze to a dejected-looking young couple nestled in the corner, their expressions as dim as the nightclub. "You, Mom," the magician called, his voice smooth. "A penny for your thoughts." With a flourish, he pulled a copper coin from her ear, holding it aloft like a trophy. The woman hesitated. "Well, that guy's trick sounds good to me. I owe 25K in student debt. It'll take me 10 years of waiting tables to pay for the useless degree I bought. So, 20 grand, right here." She tapped the table. "Granted." The magician closed his hand around the penny and a cloud of smoke swallowed it. The audience gasped, eyes wide with anticipation. "There you are," he announced proudly, extending his hand to give the coin to the young woman. She stared at it, bemused. She nodded, as if she'd known all along that the magician wasn't for real. "Great, a penny," she sighed. 30,000 more, and I can make next month's loan payment." She examined the coin a bit more, then announced, "It's not even the right color." This last observation drew the attention of her boyfriend, a numismatist, who took the coin and scrutinized it with the attention of a neurosurgeon. "White penny. Steel. Minted in 1944. Rare as hell. Even a circulated one of these goes for 30,000. He exclaimed, excited as a kid on Christmas. The young couple's spirits transmuted to confused hope. The small crowd buzzed with curiosity. Alex noticed the shift, sensing the electric energy building around him. He had their attention now, and knew from long experience that he'd keep it for the rest of the show. "Who's next?" he asked again, scanning the audience for the next willing participant, his eyes eager. His gaze fell upon another couple who looked like they could be newlyweds, their spirits not dampened a bit by the bleak surroundings. The young woman hung onto her bow like a life preserver. The fellow spoke confidently. "True love," he said, paying his girlfriend a flirtatious wink. "We want true love." Alex's face softened. "True love, eh?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a deck of cards, fanning them out with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Pick a card," he said, extending the deck toward the man, who hesitated only briefly before pulling a card free. "Show it to everyone, except me, of course." The man turned the card around for the audience to see. Laughter enveloped the room as the crowd recognized the Queen of Hearts. The magician held out the deck to the young man. "Back into the deck, please." He shuffled the cards with a flourish, the cards whirring between his fingers as he riffled through them. "Now," the magician said, lowering his voice theatrically, "let's see where love takes us." He snapped his fingers. A spark jumped from his hands. He pulled out a card with a grand flourish. "Your true love," he declared, handing it to the man. The man flipped the card over, revealing the 2 of clubs. He frowned, visibly disappointed. He shook his head. The magician raised his eyebrows. "Oh dear." Alex exclaimed, his eyes widening in surprise. "I think I've made a mistake." Then, after letting a dramatic pause pass, he turned to the woman sitting next to the man. "Perhaps the Queen of your heart should check her purse." The room's spirits rose in expectant murmurs. The woman blinked, confused. "My purse?" "Yes," Alex insisted, gesturing toward her bag. "Have a look." With a bewildered expression, she reached into her purse and gasped. Slowly, she withdrew the Queen of Hearts, take to which was a small velvet box. Her hand trembled as she opened the box to reveal an engagement ring inside. The audience burst into applause as the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she cried, turning to her stunned boyfriend. "Yes, I'll marry you." The man looked genuinely astonished. He stammered, then grinned lopsidedly. He turned to Alex, who gave him a wink. He remembered his old mentor, Orion. "Magic isn't about fooling people," the old wizard had said. "It's about creating a sense of wonder." Alex surveyed the crowd, small but starry-eyed. "Thank you, Orion," he silently said. The manager approached the magician as the last of the crowd, bubbling with chatter about the show, trickled out of the club. The magician was packing away his props, carefully placing them into a small leather case. His velvet coat hung loosely off his shoulders. His eyes still twinkled with the residual thrill of the evening's performance. "Hey, kid," the manager said, lighting a cigarette. He glanced around the emptying room with a frown. "You did good out there. Real good. I don't know how the hell you did that ring trick, but they ate it up." Alex smiled, but didn't stop packing his gear. "The best tricks are the simplest ones," he said cryptically. "But what about Tommy?" the manager pressed. "Tommy, the drunk," explained the manager. "Where do you hide him?" "Ah," replied the magician, grinning. "He's someplace safe. A bit confused, maybe, but he's all right." The manager thought about pursuing the matter, but let it pass. A generation of experience with a generation of stage magicians told him that asking about the tricks was useless. Illusionists never explained their secrets. "Listen," the manager continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "How do you feel about doing another show? You've got a booking here as long as you want." The magician shook his head, his movements deliberate. "Sorry, only one show to a venue. A promise to my master." The manager exhaled smoke, letting the silence linger before chuckling. "Can't say I blame you. I'd hightail it out of this dump if I could." Alex smiled, then returned his attention to his packing. The manager hesitated, as the germ of an idea dawned upon him. He flicked the cigarette away. "Hey, how about doing a birthday party?" The magician raised a curious eyebrow. His interest piqued. "A birthday party?" he repeated, his tone neutral, but a hint of curiosity creeping in. The manager nodded, pulling out a wad of bills from his pocket. He fanned them out. The crisp 20s crinkled. "I can make it worth your while." The magician glanced at the money, but remained unmoved. He started to turn away. "It's not about the money," the manager added quickly, his voice dropping lower. "It's my grandson." Alex paused, looking up at the manager now. Something shifted inside him. "He could really use a boost, you know," the manager continued, his whole heart behind his words. "He's angry about a lot of things. I thought maybe a little magic might lift his spirits." He sighed deeply, as if the world was burdening his shoulders. "His birthday's tomorrow. He's turning 11. "Maybe," Alex murmured. "Tell me more." As the manager described the gig, the magician's grin grew wider and wider. The children, glad for a chance to escape the boredom of the hospital's pediatric ward, sat eagerly at the cafeteria's tables. Some of the children, the less infirm ones, even bounced in their seats, awaiting the arrival of a man the nurses had called the magician. The anxious waiting was interrupted by a pop, a cloud of smoke exploding in the corner of the room. When the haze cleared, there stood the magician, his faded velvet coat hanging a little loose on his frame, an open, friendly smile spread across his face. A nurse standing nearby blinked in surprise, mesmerized by the magician's materialization. One little girl, frail but awestruck, whispered, "Where'd you come from?" Before the magician could respond, a sharp voice erupted. "What's the point of this?" The speaker was a boy, his head bald from treatments. He glared at the magician with eyes far too old for his 11 years. "It's bad enough that I have to stay in the He made air quotes with his fingers. Children's ward. But they really think I'm gonna feel better by some caped dimwit pulling rabbits out of hats. Please. The magician met the boy's fierce gaze with a steady calm. No rabbits or silly hats here, he said softly. Just a humble entertainer, trying to make a little magic, if you'll let me. The awestruck girl chimed in again. What tricks are you gonna do? As if on cue. The magician bowed. Actually, he said, taking on his practiced conspiratorial tone, I'm not going to tell you what I'll do. Instead, you. He swept a hand toward the children. Are going to tell me what I'll do. The boy was unimpressed. His eyes narrowed. Fine, he said. You wanna do a trick? Okay. I wish for a brontosaurus. Let's see you do that. His voice dripped with sarcasm. The magician's lips curved into a smile, but there was something deeper in his gaze now, something that shimmered with both understanding and a trace of sorrow. Granted, he said. With a flourish of his hand, he snapped his fingers exploded with a small flash. The beast was the size of a cat, but otherwise it looked like a denizen of Jurassic Park. The children looked on in astonishment as the tiny toy-sized brontosaurus meandered at the boy's feet, staring befuddled at the floor, its dull eyes searching for a patch of grass. The boy eyed the mini dino with a skeptical gaze. Cool hologram, he laughed acridly. But the boy's mouth fell open when he reached out toward the gentle beast, and his finger met a solid skin that felt like leather. The brontosaurus flickered, then vanished. Unfortunately, the magician said, the hospital doesn't allow pets on the ward, but I'll see that he's waiting for you at home. When? Make me better. The boy blurted, a flash of hope. Raw, desperate hope suddenly blazing in his eyes. He clenched his fists, his voice trembling as he said, Make me better. That's what I want. I wish to be better. The magician looked stricken, his smile faltered, he winced with pain. I'm so sorry, he whispered. But one trick to a customer. The boy's face crumpled, tears springing to his eyes. Silence hung over the room for a long moment. The magician, his heart heavy, turned again to the awestruck girl, whose wide eyes were still gleaming. With a soft smile, Alex said, a penny for your thoughts. He drew a penny from her ear and offered it to her. What trick would you like to see? The girl looked up at him, her small, pale hand reaching out to take the penny. She thought for a moment, then looked over at the boy, her expression as gentle as velvet. I like his idea, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She glanced back up at the magician. I want for him to get better. Now it was the magician who was awestruck. He searched his memory, which spanned more decades than anyone would believe, for a moment where a request had inspired him with such wonder. People's wishes, especially grown-ups' wishes, were usually so small: money and status, pep in their love lives, an occasional demand for raw power. Mr. Scraggly, spindly and tall. Mr. Scraggly walks the halls. If Mr. Scraggly was found to like you, then Mr. Scraggly would surely find you. Or at least, that's how the story goes. The story of Mr. Scraggly has been told to every kid in my town for whom knows how long is one of those scary stories that the old-timers tell their children to keep them from running off and making fools of themselves. Basically, it's our town's version of the boogeyman. Spooky narrative audiobooks. There's an old abandoned boarding school, the Jackson School, that is just on the outside of town, and supposedly has someone roaming the halls at night hunting any kids dumb enough to trespass. That someone is dubbed Mr. Scraggly. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, it's not as straightforward as it should be. No one can keep their story straight on who or what Mr. Scraggly actually is. Some say he came from an old rundown circus. Some say he's a serial killer that escaped from a nearby psych ward. Some say he's an old Indian curse placed upon the school. And some say he's a townsfolk's mutated baby that they left in the woods. From lizard people to aliens, the stories always seem to get more wild with every generation. Sometimes Mr. Scraggly is a man. Sometimes he's a spider-like creature. The stories even differ on what happens when he gets you. The only true consistencies are that Mr. Scraggly has long limbs, walks through the halls of the Jackson School, will try to find you if you enter said school, and as the name suggests, he looks quite scraggly. Whatever that means. In spite of the legend, over the years it has become a bit of a tradition for the students of my old high school to break into the old Jackson School where Mr. Scraggly is said to roam. Everyone had to do it at least once just to mess around and say that they did. Sex, drugs, vandalism, trespassing, acting like idiots, everything that stupid teens do, myself included, without parental supervision. All that is to say that everyone has their own story of Mr. Scraggly, and now that you're all caught up, this one's mine. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was late in the hot Oklahoma spring, and the night before senior skip day. My friends all thought it would be a perfect night to explore the Jackson boarding school because we figured the local cops would be more prepared the next day. That is if they would even care at all. The logic wasn't wrong. I wish it was, but it wasn't. No police at all. It was just my friends and I that night. There were 5 of us after the 3 of us, Claire, Daniel, and I met with our 2 other friends, Jeremy and Emma, outside the school in a fit of boredom. Jeremy was, well, let's face it, a bit of a douche. Not in a bad way. He was one of my closest friends for years, and despite his douchiness, we as a group all loved the guy, along with everyone else that knew him. Basically, he was the stereotypical popular kid with an annoyingly high amount of charisma that made it hard not to love him. On the opposite end of the spectrum was Daniel, who was, how do I put this politely, a little basic, boring, a stick in the mud, not to any fault of his own, but to the fault of his parents being the most helicoptery parents to have ever helicoptered. I'm sure you get the picture because we all know that type of overbearing family. Still, Daniel was great in his own way, and had the added benefit of having a car. He also gave in to peer pressure easily enough that we could get him to join in on our wild adventures. In this case, casual trespassing. Claire was never really close to any of us except Daniel, but she still liked to hang around with our group. She mostly just stood to the side watching and laughing without adding much until she decided to hit us with a snarky remark, but still, she fit in well. We liked having her. And last but not least, there was Jeremiah's sister, Emma. I'm sure you'll see how I felt about her as the story goes on, but just like most high school crushes go, it didn't pan out. In short, though, she was my world. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The 5 of us all managed to sneak out under the guise of fake concert plans. I'm sure my parents knew I was lying, but they didn't mention anything before Daniel picked me up. Claire and I were in Daniel's car as he took us to the road outside the Jackson School. Here we are. Guys, who are we betting is first to get caught by Mr. Scraggly? Daniel said jokingly while looking at Claire and I. I stepped out of Daniel's car and onto the road where I took a deep breath of the muggy late-night air. The school was just a short walk away, standing behind a tall chain-link fence. The school was a large 3-story brick and wood building with weathered white paint. Upon seeing it, it obviously wasn't designed to look comfortable. Even on the first floor, the windows were slightly raised in a way that was more suited for a prison than for a school. While I was taking in the surroundings, I answered Daniel's question. Honestly, probably you. I said, giving him a teasing look that said, I'm sorry. Claire got out of Daniel's car and stretched her arms up in the air while she answered, yeah, I think he's right. You're the one with the car keys after all. Claire gave a playful smile to Daniel, which caused Daniel to smile with his hand raised and finger pointed as he was ready to retort, but he didn't get a chance before we heard a familiar voice coming from the side of the road in front of us. It's about time you guys got here. Jeremiah called out. Claire, Daniel, and I looked over to see Jeremiah and Emma walking in our direction. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we could have walked the whole building 3 times before you guys got here, Emma said in a teasing manner. I crossed my arms and tilted my head to Emma. Aha. You guys just got here, didn't you? I asked smugly. Emma placed her hands on her hips and smirked. Actually, we got here 4 minutes ago, thank you very much. Ah, you poor thing, I said. I'm sorry to keep you both waiting, my lady. Will you ever find it in your heart to forgive me? As Emma and Jeremiah stop next to the rest of us, Emma says, I'll forgive you. Just this once, of course. Now I was the one smirking. After having lost myself in Emma's eyes, I pulled myself together and looked around at the rest of the group. Is everyone ready? Oh yeah, says Jeremiah, turning on an annoyingly bright flashlight in Daniel's eyes. I was practically born ready. Do you not know who you're talking to? No, we know, says Daniel, squinting and covering his eyes. Just trying to forget that you exist. And weren't you born premature? Ha, I was just eager. Jeremiah walks up to Daniel laughing before patting him on the shoulder and handing him a flashlight. Glad they drug you along, bud. Daniel grabs the light from Jeremiah. That makes one of us because I still don't know if I am. It'll be fine, Emma says to Daniel. She looks at me before handing me a flashlight. Are you ready? I flicked on the flashlight and pointed the light menacingly beneath my chin. Let's go find Mr. Scraggly. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Who's going first? Asks Jeremiah while looking around at the group. He's holding up an out-of-place corner on the bottom edge of the tall wire fence to create an opening. Is there not another way in? Daniel asks Jeremiah. Preferably one that doesn't involve me crawling on the cold dirt. I chimed in. Well, unless you have a pair of bolt cutters on you, you can always climb the fence. Ooh, I guess it's been decided who's going first, over or under Danny boy. Emma asks as she smacks Daniel on the butt. Daniel looks up and down the fence before letting out an audible breathy sigh. Fine. Under it is. Daniel lowers himself to the ground and starts to mumble something under his breath while he belly crawls under the raised area of the fence. Attaboy, Daniel, shouts Jeremiah, clearly pleased with himself. Claire, you up. Claire covers her head with the hood of her sweater, so as not to let it or her hair get caught on the fence. You better not let that drop on me, Jeremiah. Ye of little faith. I wouldn't dream of it. Jeremiah gives a wink in the direction of Emma and I. The temptation he felt to let the fence drop on Claire simply because of her comment was nerve-wrackingly obvious, but he stayed his hand. Emma, Jeremiah asks, cueing his sister up next. Don't mind if I do. Emma elbows me in the shoulder. Enjoy the show. Emma then gets on her stomach and starts to crawl to the opposite side of the fence. Then there were two. Jeremiah rises to his feet and stands by my side before talking to the group in his usual teasing voice. See you guys later. We're gonna go grab something to eat. Emma pipes up. Be sure to get me an extra order of get your sorry butts over here before I come back to kick them over. Do you think that comes with fries? Claire playfully asks Daniel. I walk to the fence to pull it up for Jeremiah to crawl under. I guess they're not hungry. Jeremiah dives on his stomach to crawl through the fence. That's good because I am hungry for adventure. Jeremiah's statement is followed by 3 boos from the other side of the fence before he makes it across. Once he reaches the other side, he relieves me of my duty and grabs the fence once again. Your turn. Don't get stuck. You made it under, so I think I'll manage, I said before I lowered myself to the ground. It was chilled under the night sky, and the grass slightly damp. I crawled my way through the opening while feeling the wire brush my shoulders as I moved, and when I stood back up to pat the dirt and grass off of my clothes, I saw a figure briefly move past one of the windows of the school. Did you guys see that? I said, pointing up to where I saw the figure. Oh yeah, that's just Mr. Scraggly, Jeremiah says, looking in the direction that I'm pointing despite there obviously being nothing there anymore. Oh great, he's already scared, says Emma, putting her hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, little one. I'll protect you. That is a shock. I thought Daniel would be the first to get scared, says Claire. I too thought Daniel would be the first to get scared, says Daniel, noticeably trembling as he looks at the school. I forced out a laugh. Okay, fine. I bet it was just an animal anyway. I looked around at the high windows and boarded doors of the old school. So, how exactly do we plan to get in? Jeremiah steps forward and turns to face the whole group with a smile on his face. That's the fun part. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The basement. Claire asks while we all stand in line looking at the old battered door at the side of the school building. You want us to go into the basement? Emma points to the broken window about 10 feet above us, over or under Claire. Well, whichever we decide. I am not going first this time, Daniel says, visibly trembling. I won't lie. I had to take a good breath to ease my nerves before I said, I went last when we crawled under the fence. Looks like this time I'm up first. None of the group stopped me as I stepped forward, turned on my flashlight, and raised the basement door. Bravo 6, going dark. Good luck, soldier, says Emma. I glanced in her direction to see her saluting me as I took my first steps into the basement. The group all filed in behind me while we entered the cramped enclosure. The basement air was dusty and stale to the point my nose got dry. Damaged old school desks are scattered across the floor, as well as splintered old bookcases and used metal furnaces, and as I point my flashlight around I can make out the glistening of spiderwebs throughout the old furniture in the brick-laden room. Well, if this place isn't haunted, I don't know what place is. Yeah, says Emma in a really drawn-out tone. It definitely fits the vibe. I hate to be a buzzkill, says Daniel, but we're more likely to find tetanus than a ghost or Mr. Scraggly in this mess. A dead rat also seems likely, says Jeremiah, pointing his light around the room until he finds a beaten old staircase. There, Jeremiah says, pointed before leading the way. As we walked up the steps, every bit of the wood creaked under our weight, and every step felt like we were moving through a fun house because of the warping of the old wood, which caused the boards beneath us to be smooth at weird places and tilted or angled in others. We soon reached the top step to find a door that opened with ease. Based on the broken lock, it was probably from the damage done by other urban explorers like us trying to get into the school over the years. I slowly crept the door open and peeked my head through into the eerily empty hallways. Beside me, I could hear the giddy voice of Jeremiah say, Mr. Scraggly, we've come to play. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. So, Jeremiah, where to next? I asked as the group gathered into the hallway. I don't know. I never got further than the basement, says Jeremiah, looking around the hall in childish awe. Advertisements. Of course you haven't, says Emma, rolling her eyes. Some guide you turned out to be. Oh, come on, guys, says Jeremiah. Where's your sense of adventure? Pretty sure I left mine in the car, but I've been wrong before, says Claire. Daniel has a light shined at the massive hole in the ceiling above that reveals the next floor hallway. I think my sense of self-preservation is stronger. Fighting the urge to sneeze, I said I'm actually with Jeremiah on this one. Let's just walk around and see what there is to see. Jeremiah's eyes lit up. See, I'm glad at least one of you is having fun. Jeremiah turned to his sister. What about you, Emma? I'm just here for the ride, Emma says with her arms crossed. Perfect. Majority rules. Now, gang, who wants to split up and search for clues? Jeremiah points his light in our direction, which reveals the previously unnoticed load of dust falling from the ceiling above in a way that enhances the movement coming from the next floor. We all look up at the movement above. Oh, great, says Claire. Now Daniel needs to worry about getting mauled by a raccoon, too. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Claire and Daniel were led by Jeremiah through the rooms opposite Emma and I. It's one of those situations that in hindsight, Jeremiah was orchestrating to get Emma and I alone together over the years. As much of a pain as he could be, he was just as much a brother to me as he was to Emma. Look at all this, I said. Emma and I walked into what looked like the remnants of one of the old bunk rooms. There were beds lined along the walls of the room facing inward and packed tightly against the wall from the thin wooden structural posts in front of every other bed from floor to ceiling. keeping more in line with the prison aesthetic. It wasn't cozy, to say the least. From the looks of things, even before this place got run down, comfort was not top priority for the residents. Still, that didn't stop Emma from joking. Emma nudged me with her elbow to get my attention, and with a wink she said, "Which bed are we taking?" "How about that one?" I pointed to the bed in the far corner. The frame showed signs of wood rot from exposure to moisture, and some of the ceiling had collapsed on top of it. Nothing gets me in the mood more than termites. Emma just laughed. "I hope Mr. Scraggly likes your sarcasm as much as I do." She turned her body to mine, grabbed my arms, and leaned in. Emma's pale blue eyes reflected the light of our flashlights like the sea, causing my entire being to melt. But before I could lean in to meet her lips, Daniel's voice came from just outside the room and stabbed me like a dagger.